Plato, when he talks about education, he considers it one of the most important elements within a civilization. He states that education should start first with the development of sensitivity. That's why he said that first you educate the human soul. And he suggested that it be done through music. And then you would introduce the other elements. According to him, a well-educated soul, a sensitive soul, can create the conditions to develop other needs. And the opposite, no. In other words, a person who has all the other basic needs like production, work, health, and so on, if they're not sensitive, all these needs can turn against society, all this capability can turn against society, even against themselves. Hence the need to first awaken a person's soul. Make that soul sensitive to the environment. Make that soul sensitive to the harmony of forms. This harmony is what we call beauty, and beauty is the object of art. Hello, welcome to another activity promoted by New Acropolis. As we do every year, we dedicate 1 week a year to promoting art. These activities are exclusively focused on art because we believe that art is one of the essential components in the formation of a human being. We will find this need expressed in various cultures. Personally, to give an example, I like to quote a Chinese proverb that says, if you have 2 loaves of bread, sell one and buy a lily. This shows the importance that this society places on the development of man's basic needs like food, productive work capacity, among other things. This development, which is given so much emphasis in education, also needs to be complemented with that type of development focused on art, meaning the appreciation of beauty. Art, the appreciation of beauty, requires a lot of sensitivity from a human being. And this sensitivity can only be achieved through an educational process. This sensitivity is essential in social development. It's no use having an education that teaches people to do things, that teaches people certain techniques, certain skills, that makes these people productive, self-sustaining, but doesn't necessarily make them sensitive. We know that a culture that can have everything, all the basic things we imagine for socioeconomic development, for a person's social development, if sensitivity is lacking, this development can be tremendously harmed. We can, by observing society, notice several moments or situations where, even though people have everything, this lack of sensitivity towards others. This lack of sensitivity towards the life of nature, this lack of sensitivity even towards oneself, can trigger a series of tremendously complex factors from a social perspective. Observing the current world, for example, there are many nations that have these basic conditions, which are usually provided through an educational process, and these basic conditions are very well developed. However, there are many conflicts, many crises. And it's clear that this is due to a series of factors that leaves humans to be insensitive to their environment, to be insensitive to another human being, and to be insensitive to themselves. Plutarch, when talking about education, didn't compare it to filling a cup like pouring water into a jug. He likens it more to the act of lighting a fire. That means that education shouldn't just add a bunch of things to a person. The main role of education is to ensure that what is inherent to the human being, what is inherent to human life, develops and reaches its full splendor. Therefore, like fire, when we light a candle, the only thing it does is consume what is already latent in the candle, all its combustion potential. Agitation should do the same with a human being. It should draw out the best in a person and make that potential available to themselves, to society, and to the other beings they interact with. Therefore, our education process needs to develop this ability in humans to make use of what is already inside them. To make use of those elements that are a bit dormant, but that we can tap into at any moment, as long as we know how to access them. In general, we already have this somewhat developed. Every human being has a bit of what we call common sense. In other words, without having gone through any specialized instruction, without having attended any very sophisticated school or any elaborate educational process, they can relate well with people, relate well with life, as long as they make use of this common sense, this shared understanding, which we sometimes also refer to. We could notice that humans have an interesting characteristic that sets them apart from animals. For example, animals, when they're born, already know how to walk. They are born already looking for their mother's breast to nurse. Humans aren't like that. Humans are born completely dependent. He needs someone to pick him up. He needs to be taken to the breast. In fact, he even needs someone to teach him how to nurse. We know when we visit a lady who just had a baby, how difficult it is in those first days until the baby learns to properly latch onto the mother's breast. Therefore, from the start, he needs to learn. Learning to walk is a whole process, and sometimes it's even beautiful to watch a child learning to crawl, learning to walk. But everything has to be taught, and we do this throughout the whole process. We're constantly teaching the child to nurse, teaching the child to walk, teaching the child to grab objects, to feed themselves, and so on. And unbelievably, sometimes our process stops at an important moment because we don't teach children to develop certain essential skills for life. For example, the ability to deal with your own emotions, the ability to manage your temperament, and even that sensitivity that allows you to access those deeper places of the human soul where knowledge and fundamental elements for perceiving life and relating to life are stored. Well, in my talk today, I intend to emphasize these aspects that are usually within us, which we use more or less regardless of our education, which is this ability we have to perceive life and its expressions. Especially in those moments when life, when it expresses itself in a certain way, does so with such splendor that it creates a moment of beauty, a moment of enchantment. For example, when at sunset we watch the sun go down with all those wonderful images of colors, shadows, and lights, we are captivated. And we're captivated not because someone taught us. Something seems to resonate with us, and it paralyzes us for a moment, and it makes our attention completely focused on it. And we can notice that even children in their early years already turn their attention to a sunset. They already turn their attention to the beauty of a flower. Therefore, we can see that she has a certain sensitivity to that form. She has a certain sensitivity to beauty. But this sensitivity sometimes only shows up when there's this grandeur of beauty. And when this beauty or this expression of life is still very embryonic, it's not clearly perceived. To really grasp this idea of the relationship we have with life, form, and beauty, and the need for sensitivity, I'm going to give an example that's relatively simple so we can gradually understand this concept. When, for example, we observe plants and their way of developing, we'll notice various stages of their growth, each with its own moments of beauty. Just like when we observe the development of a human being, for example, the growth of a child, we notice that they are in a process of growing, but every stage from birth, the early years, childhood, to adolescence, expresses a unique beauty typical of each period. It has various moments of beauty, and we're not always sensitive to all of them. Sometimes we're only sensitive to those moments when beauty screams, when beauty enchants, when we can't help but be dazzled by so much beauty. If we look at, for example, the process of plants, they're very similar. We can imagine, for example, that in a certain environment, we manage to find or visualize some rose seeds. I believe that most of us wouldn't be able to identify this well with the culture we have and the accessibility we have. If the seed were a bit disorganized, a bit dirty, these seeds would get mixed up with that mess, with that dirt, and would just sit there like something worthless. We wouldn't find any beauty in the seed. And we also couldn't imagine its development and what could grow from those tiny seeds. But if an experienced gardener passed by and saw that seed, he would most likely be very attracted to it. Look at that beauty, a seed of such a rose, of such a quality of rose. He would be able not only to identify that there's a potential for life there, but even identify what quality of rose it would be. Just like us, for example, with the seeds we're more familiar with, like an avocado seed or an orange seed. We know that inside there lies the potential for the development of a lush and beautiful tree. But the gardener with the tiny seed, because of the sensitivity he has, the development he has, the experience he has, he can identify and imagine the splendor of the rose that's dormant inside. So he would probably gather those seeds, just like we would collect something very valuable to us. He would keep those seeds and sort them out. Then he would check each seed and see that some were beautiful and nice, while others were a bit deformed by pests or poor development. And he would know how to recognize the pretty ones from the ugly ones. And he would already be saying to himself, "Look at these beautiful seeds I've selected." In other words, there would already be a degree of beauty in that seed, because there would already be a degree of life in that seed. He would already start to relate life, the form of the seed, and the beauty. He would already be able to, in that tiny embryo, discover and visualize a bit of beauty. We know that he has more sensitivity than most people who are unaware of the nature of that form. Planting this seed a few days later, as long as it gets the right amount of water and heat and its proper nutrients, if we went back there, we'd see a small stem with some embryonic leaves, some little greens. Like any fertile soil, when something grows, a bunch of other things grow along with it. For us, who don't yet have much sensitivity to the development of a plant's life, especially a small rose bush, it would all just look like weeds to us. And we wouldn't have much trouble pulling all that out to keep the space clean. But the gardener would be able to look and say, "What a beautiful rosebush sprout. Let me protect it." He moves away or pulls out the other leaves that could kill it. And he would be able to exclaim, "How beautiful." In other words, even when it's tiny, he already identifies that it's developing and that the quality of life it expresses already has a certain degree of greatness. Therefore, he already considers it beautiful because, in some way, he has the stages of perception recorded within him. He knows that this type of sprout is exactly a rose bush and that it already has a level of life that corresponds to its age, to the days since it was planted. Just like us, when we observe, for example, a 3-month-old baby, we think it's beautiful. Look how pretty, look how well developed. Look at how it's already got skills. Look how it moves its eyes. Look how it moves its arms, and so on. In other words, we can, in the process of life's development, perceive in each form it expresses its own beauty at that moment. Well, following the example of the rose bush, after a few days, this rose bush would probably reach a level of maturity. I believe we would still keep passing by, looking at the rose bush, finding it interesting. Some would already be able to identify that it's a rose bush, but I believe most wouldn't. But the day we arrive there and see several roses all in bloom, even if we're not very familiar with that type of rose, we'd be enchanted. Why? Because the life that was in that seed is now in its full splendor. And usually, it seems like we have an image of splendor within us, which Plato sometimes called an archetype. We all carry within us the ability to perceive the archetypes of life. They mean the perfect models. Every time a life reaches its fullness, the beauty is so striking that our soul vibrates, and we feel drawn to that beauty. We feel it. Look how beautiful. And then we would say, what a beautiful moment, what beautiful roses. Well, obviously, we are part of this whole story of the beauty of a moment. That moment of its maximum splendor. And the gardener, more sensitive to that type of seed, was able to be part of its entire process. He found the seed beautiful, he found the sprouts beautiful, he found the development of the rose bush itself beautiful, and now he finds the whole ensemble beautiful, the rose bush and the roses, to be precise. In other words, with his sensitivity, he was able to participate in some way in the development of this form of life. I believe that if we went a little further with this example, we could see that in the development of the rose bush, if he had messed up any part of the process, like the amount of water or nutrients, or if some pest had attacked the rose bush, he would identify it and protect it. Then he would notice that there was something added that wasn't right, something that didn't belong to that unit of life. In some way, he was beginning to understand the life of the rosebush. He blends so much with the rosebush that he starts to understand the mysteries of the life that resides in that seed, its development processes, its law, its needs, its moments of fullness, its steps of development. We wouldn't be able to be part of that. And if he participated simply out of love for life, not because he wanted to sell the rose, but out of love for the life of the seed, for the life of the rosebush, you would say he has a degree of goodness. And very likely, this deep involvement he has with the rosebush would spark certain types of curiosities in him that he could very well ask himself and the rose. How do you manage to make a white rose from shapeless clay, from a dark, somewhat brownish earth? Or how do you manage from chaos, from all this chaos that is the earth itself, which has a lot of potential but is all disorganized, like a tiny little seed, to bring forth such splendor of beauty? And if this gardener had a bit of a philosophical bent, he might also ponder how, from nothing, from a void, like science talks about the Big Bang, a great explosion, and from that explosion, so much beauty that we see. How did they manage to get so many seeds of life to build, from that chaotic confusion of the explosion, so much beauty? In other words, by following the process of development, life, form, beauty, with his sensitivity and goodness, he could uncover the deep mysteries of life. Some mysteries would be revealed to him. That's the importance of having sensitivity to life. And not just be, sometimes, near spectators. And many times, even explorers, I believe that if this rose were outside a house, when it bloomed, people would remain indifferent throughout the whole development process. But when the rose appeared, they'd probably pick it, yank it out, and take it to their homes. And even then, they wouldn't have the sensitivity to put it in a vase with water so it could complete its life cycle as every living being deserves. Without sensitivity, sometimes we just want to enjoy these things when they're already finished. So, we need to develop a bit of sensitivity to life, develop a bit of goodness, to know how to engage with life, to be able to be part of life. I'll give another example in this perception we have of life. Form and beauty, because I used something very static. It moves, but it's static when compared to the animal kingdom. When we look at plants, they have their movements, their charms, and we can identify those moments of splendor. But we also do the same with the animal kingdom. It also has its development and splendor with some additional characteristics that life reveals in this kingdom and that aren't yet present in the plant kingdom. Well, we all know how much we're captivated by those movies we find on TV, in the cinema, available for sale in bookstores and specialty shops that talk about animal life. In general, we're interested in all of them. We spend hours and hours enjoying and observing certain developments and habits of animal life. But I'll take as an example when we come across, for instance, images like the lion, for example, which really captivates us. I believe it's one of the most sought after and watched movies when it comes to those films that showcase the big animals, especially the fiercer ones. Maybe, also, because of the archetype of beauty we have within us, which is enjoying seeing this beauty that Kant referred to, where beauty, when manifested, sometimes has two different characteristics. It has a characteristic of beauty, simply beautiful, like a flower. But there's another kind of beauty that, besides being beautiful, scares us a little. We call it a bit of a terrifying beauty. Like the volcano, for example. It's beautiful, but at the same time, it hits us with a bit of fear, a bit of respect, a bit of depth. So this beauty is called sublime beauty. Maybe the lion captivates you so much because it has both. It's beautiful because of its lion form, and it's also beautiful because it always attracts us a bit with the respect it imposes on us, with its power, with its strength. But the truth is that we, when it comes to animals, taking the lion as an example, have a bit of that gardener's ease, even without having seen much of the lion or lived much with the lion, which isn't really part of Brazilian culture. But I'm sure that if we took 30 fully grown lions and had a lion parade for us, among 10 people, I believe those 10 would easily pick out which lion is the most well-developed, the most beautiful. Why? Because we have a bit of an archetype of life. In its fullness, it exudes beauty. So we realize that the same physical beauty of a lion, even if we don't know much about its nature, we'll be able to tell by comparing it with another, which one has more splendor of life. And we'll say, this one is the most beautiful. We would see that some are a bit thinner, others haven't grown as much, some don't have as much strength, and others don't have as much power. When we hear its roar, we'll notice that some have a slightly weaker roar, while others are stronger. So, in some way, that physical beauty of the lion enchants us. So, just as we're enchanted by the splendor of a rose, we also be enchanted by the splendor of life as it develops in its entirety in an animal. And we'd even be able to see the beauty in lion cubs. It's very common to see a litter, for example, sometimes of our puppies or lions, like the case we just talked about, where when several are born 5, 6, 7, and we look, there's always one that's a bit scrawny, and the mother herself already leaves it aside, and we know that there's a lack of life in that being. So, when we look, if we were given the chance to choose simply by considering beauty, compassion, which sometimes makes us want to help the weaker ones, but just beauty, we would select those we consider to have more fullness of life. We would say this form is more beautiful. And if we followed the development of these lions, we would see that we would select exactly based on the beauty of each moment. We could say that each moment has its own beauty, and that we have within us a sixth sense, or as Plato likes to say, a certain archetype of life that allows us to identify when this archetype is present at that moment and when it isn't, because it seems to resonate something inside us. And that's what I sometimes call this common sense we have to recognize a lot about life without ever having had a set of instructions for it or proper education for that kind of recognition. But I want to point out another characteristic. When we observe animals, they have a certain liveliness. They have a certain sense of movement. They have certain habits. They have their own way of hunting, feeding, defending, and attacking, which fascinates us. We're not only fascinated by the animal's physical form, but also by its liveliness, the way it acts. And when we watch, for example, an animal documentary, we spend hours waiting for the moment it does something, how it moves, the charm with which it moves, how it manages to identify where its prey is, how it perceives it, how it sniffs it out. For instance, how it stalks, how it positions itself, how it moves, and when it attacks. And all of this, if it were filmed in slow motion, is impressive because every movement seems perfect to us. So life enchants us not only when it blooms like a plant, revealing its beauty in an almost static way, but also when it moves, especially in animals that have this ability to move. In other words, we also want to see the soul of the animal, the liveliness of the animal, its movements. And we also have a certain archetype. When we look at a lion, we expect certain types of movements, certain types of behaviors from the lion. There's a really interesting story that we all know, which is The Wizard of Oz, where there's a character, the lion, who lacks courage. He spends all his time then searching for courage. Do you remember me watching that movie when I was a kid? I was rooting for the lion to gain courage throughout the whole movie. Why? Because the lion was missing something. And that's exactly how the movie develops. Because in the archetype we have within us, the lion is powerful, the lion is skillful, the lion is the king of animals, the lion is courageous. And when one of these characteristics is missing, we notice that there's a lack of life in that lion. In other words, life isn't just lacking because of physical characteristics. It's also lacking due to its attitudes. And we expect from the lion an attitude that isn't lion-like. For example, if the lion starts barking, we're going to say something is wrong, something is different, something doesn't match the life of this lion. This lion isn't as beautiful as the other lions. Why? Because its actions aren't consistent with what is inherent to the kingdom it belongs to. What is inherent to the seed from which it developed. We have, then, a bit more sensitivity when it comes to the animal kingdom sometimes. In fact, I believe that most human beings, except for those who exploit the animal kingdoms, like certain types of hunters and so on, love animals to the point that we don't want them to go extinct. And we get really sad when we realize that some species is going extinct. We love animals when we know, for example, that they're lacking food in certain situations. And we want to help, and many even contribute financially, to preserve the habitat of a certain animal. In some way, then, we already participate in animal life. But there are those who get personally involved with animals, who even sometimes get close to some wild animals. And these people share with us enchanting experiences because there's so much mystery that reigns in the animal world that we become fascinated with the animal kingdom. For example, because it recently came to mind, I remember that around 2016, Fausto did an interview with a man from Ilha Grande on the beach in Rio de Janeiro, there on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, who one day found a penguin in the sea, which sometimes shows up in that region, sometimes even in parody, but it was all covered in oil, because there had been an oil spill, and during its journey, it got all soaked in oil, so it ended up on the beach, which wasn't normal for that time of year. This fisherman who was there, he took the penguin, took care of it, gave it a bath, brought it to his house, put it in the bathtub, gave it a bath, and started living with the penguin. They formed a friendship, exchanging kisses and so on. After the penguin was all better, he took it to the beach, and the penguin went back to its homeland. He probably traveled back to Antarctica. It stayed there for about a year. And what was the surprise? The following year, it showed up on the beach again and went to greet the fisherman and have a whole celebration with him. And for years and years, for 7 years, he did this. But the story had a continuation that I found really interesting. It stopped visiting the fisherman. For 5 years, the fisherman kept it going, and there's more. And during this time, it seems that some American filmmaker got interested in doing a report or making a movie about it. I'm not sure how it's going to be, and went to visit the fisherman to interview him. And it had been 5 years since the penguin appeared. When they were making that movie, it showed up again. Recently, that happened. Seems like it was last year. I'm not sure it was last year. What do I want to highlight? Can you imagine the ability of this penguin whose brain is tiny? Because we tend to think everything is about the brain, this sensitivity it developed for the fisherman, this ability to go all the way to Antarctica and come back, even though it's one of the creatures most. Of the animals that have the most predators, meaning the risks, whales, sharks, a bunch of threats it faces, it has this ability to go back and forth to visit the fisherman. Imagine the amount of things that are inside what we call this animal's soul. How many things interfere with its movements? The amount of things that influence its relationship with life. In a way, all those who get really involved with the animal start to understand these mysteries too, this life that communicates over distances, just like it sometimes happens with humans. It's very common, for example, how many examples do we know of a mother who feels a certain kind of unease and intuitively identifies it as the unease of a daughter who might be far away, very remote? She calls her daughter, and the daughter confirms at that moment that she's indeed going through a tough time. So everything is very interconnected in this great human mystery, this great mystery of life. And the people who take part in life, in general, start to understand more. They begin to have more sensitivity to life, more sensitivity to animals, more sensitivity to plants. And they start to identify more clearly all its beauty, not just the beauty of bodies, but the beauty of the way of being of all kinds of life. Well, if we look at humans, we'll see that they have all of this in their development process too. He, like flowers too, starts as an embryo. When he's inside the mother's womb, he has his whole form, which sometimes even looks like a little stone, then sometimes looks like a little animal with a tail, and so on, until he takes on the human form. We see that he takes on various forms of life. And all these forms, as long as they're at the right time or the right moment, enchant us. And he really goes through this whole process of childhood, which is very beautiful, adolescence, which is very beautiful, youth up to his physical prime, his physical maturity. And there's also the way they learn how to feed themselves, how to run, how to play, how to educate themselves, how to go to school. And all these phases of curiosity and learning are also beautiful. But we add other elements to this liveliness, this disposition of the human being. For us to call a human being beautiful, generally, we don't just pay attention to the physical form and its development. Not even this basic form of movement, this basic liveliness of the animal, which simply consists of survival, procreation, and the way it defends itself, the way it attacks. These elements are also part of being human, but if some elements are missing, which we're going to add now, we would say that even though this human being meets all the conditions of aesthetic and physical beauty that we can observe, for example, in a lion, all the conditions of the lion's splendid movements, or all the beauty of a flower, the body might be the most perfect according to the aesthetic standards each person prefers. We wouldn't call this person beautiful if some fundamental elements for being human were missing. In other words, in our natural perception of the human being, in this archetype that we have within our hearts, so to speak, or in our minds, if you prefer, something would be missing if we observed in their movements, in their behavior, certain elements. We would feel that something is missing for that life to reach its splendor to the point where we could say, at this age, they are beautiful. At this moment, he is beautiful. And that's where I'd like to comment on just a few of these points, because there are many, but at least the most important ones, just so we can see that it's common sense. It's not something that needs to be educated, that needs to be shaped. Yes, it has to go through a basic education process like that of a human being, but we can identify it without much, let's say, without much specialization in the ability to observe the subtleties of the human being. For example, we can see a person who has a lot of property, a lot of wealth, who has plenty at home. When they come across a human being who has nothing, who is hungry, who is struggling, and they give part of what they have to the other person, we call that a beautiful attitude, a beautiful gesture. And we have admiration for that person. If, on the other hand, this person has enough food for themselves and their children, and there's another person who has nothing, and they don't give to this other person even though they could, we would say that's ugly. That gesture is really ugly. That person is not good. And if a person not having as much as someone who has a lot shares a bit of what they have, for example, a person who has only one piece of bread, and when they see someone hungry, they give up their own hunger to feed the other person, preferring to see the other person's happiness over their own, we say that's charming. When that happens, usually, sometimes, when something like this occurs and the press reports it, we find it charming. And when we talk to this person, it seems like there's a bit of light inside them. Kindness seems to radiate from the person. And you, even if she doesn't have a standard of aesthetic beauty, even if sometimes her behaviors and movements and everything aren't quite in line with the standards of a well-nourished, well-formed person who has gone through a process of education for good habits and so on, when we look at her, we perceive beauty. sometimes more beauty than that person who denied everything. Because when we look at this person who denies everything about themselves, we notice a certain shadow, a certain degree of detachment. We don't know why. We start to notice the light within people. Well, you've also seen people who sometimes find objects recently. I heard about a case, for example, at the airport, where a person, one of those who clean the airport, found a suitcase full of money. She went to return a suitcase full of money, even though she was in need. Why? Because she doesn't feel right keeping something that isn't hers. Because she knows that the other person suffers when they lose something, and she doesn't want to pass on that suffering. We consider that gesture charming, the gesture of honesty. We also find it charming when a person is truthful, especially when this truthfulness means she doesn't want to lie to deceive someone else to gain some benefit for herself. That she is transparent, that she is genuine. We call that person charming. When, for example, we observe a person who is very sensitive, they walk by something beautiful, they notice it, and they want to contemplate it, they want to see it. Sometimes they want to fix something, they want to clean it up so it stands out more, they want to be involved. When we notice that a person realizes when someone else is suffering, when they notice that the other person doesn't like the way they're speaking and they change the way they talk. Sensitive to surroundings, sensitive to life. We say, what a beautiful person. Now imagine if we gathered all these beautiful traits in just one person. Another example, for instance, is a person who has a degree of wisdom. Not a degree of wisdom that they use to benefit themselves, but a degree of wisdom that they use to interact with life in a more harmonious way. Because a person, for example, who has a degree of wisdom, like we sometimes know, I like to tell a story from comic book characters so as not to hit on anyone's preferences, which is the case of Batman and the Joker, his great enemy. The Joker has enormous wisdom, he knows everything, but he uses it for evil, for his own benefit, and is always trying to harm people with the knowledge he possesses. Trying to exploit people through the knowledge they possess. And we say how ugly, and sometimes even in this case, what a criminal, what a crook. In other words, how ugly this situation is. Why? Because they're using their powers, their knowledge, to take away people's lives, to harm people, to benefit only themselves, which is an extremely high degree of selfishness. Now imagine if we could picture a person who is generous, humble, kind, wise. In other words, it seems like all the splendor of a human being radiates, and all their energy, all their disposition, all their actions reflect this splendor. Just like a rose has a seed that develops until it reaches the splendor of the rose, just like the fetus of an animal develops until it reaches the splendor of its species, including in habits, the human being also has a seed. It has a seed that, according to some traditions, is in the heart of the human being. Christ says it's like a seed that lives in the heart of a human being and that this seed needs to be developed. This seed grows and produces its bodies, the development of its bodies, its habits. More basic, like it happens with animals, and then the human splendor, which is when human life stops before developing that splendor, we say it's ugly. But when it reaches this splendor and starts to show the true beauty of the human seed, we say how wonderful. Not necessarily for the beauty of the physical body, not necessarily for their social achievements, but for their fullness of beauty. We call that beautiful, and all of us sometimes have an archetype of this beauty. Sometimes we project this archetype. From there, these figures we know in all religions are born. These figures we idealize, like Christ, Buddha, now Beth, as symbols of perfection, which everyone wants to reach that splendor. It seems like we need that. To see the human archetypes expressed, to see that we too can reach this fullness of beauty, this fullness of life, this fullness of achievement. Because when we manage to express all that is developing within us, we have this feeling that nothing is missing, that the present moment contains all things, that the present moment is completely fulfilled, that we don't need anything, simply being ourselves in our fullness. This fullness might be a bit utopian because we're still in the process of developing as human beings. But a degree of fullness, I believe every human being, when they achieve it, they have a degree of happiness. He doesn't have that feeling of lack, of missing something. He doesn't have that feeling of anguish, of anxiety, of fear. Why? Because it seems like everything he needs, he has. He has the courage inherent to being human. He has the beauty inherent to being human. He has the wisdom inherent to being human. He has the generosity inherent to being human. He has the kindness inherent to being human. So all of life is fully moving in the present moment. He is not only able to harmonize what he thinks, what he feels, his motivations, and what he does, in such a way that he is able to feel this flow of life. Thoughts, feelings, motivations, and actions. But his actions in themselves communicate a lot of harmony with his surroundings, because he tunes in with life. Once all forms of development that we call goodness are nothing more than the harmony of the human being nurturing life outside of themselves, him participating in life, him knowing the mysteries of life. Through his involvement with life, his immersion in the flow of life. So we come to see that everything around him is in harmony. Him with himself and him with his environment. It's this fullness of life's flow that we call happiness. So, happiness. Life, form, and beauty are naturally within us. The only thing we need is to develop a bit more of this human sensitivity so that he realizes that their life sometimes gets stuck in its development at some point, just like it can happen with an animal or a plant. It can get blocked at some point. Something's missing. When something's missing, it gives us that feeling of anguish, of anxiety. Something's missing, and I go looking for it outside. One simple way would be to let life develop more from within. And it blossoms. Because sometimes we look outside for a lot of things that we actually find within. Plato himself talks in one of his myths about a being who fell into the sea, in which, when he spent a long time in the seaweed stuck to his body and deformed his structure. When he got out of the sea and stood in front of a mirror, and he looked in the mirror, he found his image horrifying. Since he didn't know who he was, he went out looking for more things to add to see if he could fix his image. And the more he added things, the uglier he got. Sometimes we do the same thing as that being. We feel this lack of something. Instead of removing what's in excess and letting what we are flourish, we go out looking for more things and keep adding more stuff. We want more trips, we want more possessions, we want more properties, we want more company. And we keep adding things that make our lives more complicated and less fulfilling. Sometimes we even tend to isolate ourselves at the end of life, as if we've exhausted all possibilities and become disillusioned with life. We've moved past the time of being that archetypal old person we all dream of, right? That wise old person who's in their little corner in a simple but beautiful house. Not beautiful because it's wealthy, but beautiful because it has good taste, clever details, little flowers, details of faces. Then he's there full of himself and happy. With little space because he has everything within himself. with little need to know more, because he already knows a lot about life. He already knows what's necessary for him. So, what do we need? A little bit of sensitivity, a little more sensitivity towards ourselves, a little more sensitivity towards life, to plant life, to animal life, and fundamentally to human life. And that's what I wish during this week we're promoting for all of you watching me. That in each of your daily lives, you find your opportunity to make your way of being, your way of acting, your way of speaking, reveal a little more life every day, a little more kindness, a little more generosity, a little more humility, a little more beauty, that beauty we admire so much when we see it in a human being, so that you can have a little more fulfillment. There's a quote I really like to close my talk, and it's from Sri Ram. He says that what humans are looking for in the present moment isn't fulfillment, because that's something difficult, something that will only be found in the distant future, but a little more filling, so that they can feel this movement of life within themselves. This constant growth, this flow of life with more intensity. Because this flowing with life with more intensity is what we call happiness. A little bit of happiness for everyone in their everyday moments. Thank you very much.